Good day. Today is Monday, 14th July 2025, and as you can see from the picture behind me, I am not in my usual room. I'm in another part of my house. There is a picture behind me of a rearing horse. The reason is connected to the events of about 3 or 4 weeks ago when I had a 6-day interruption of my internet. Anyway, I took various steps directly after that interruption, and I'm not going to discuss what they are in this program. Suffice to say that the engineers are here and a new system, a completely different internet system, is being installed, which hopefully will prove more reliable than the previous one. Anyway, the presence of the engineers does, however, mean that for the moment I am restricted in what I can say and do, and that does mean that this is indeed going to be a significantly shorter video than my usual videos. I hope and believe that as of tomorrow it will be service as usual. Anyway, let's quickly recap where we are. Now, today we're all waiting to hear what Donald Trump is going to announce later today when he makes his big statement about Russia. He's given some tantalizing glimpses of his intentions, and we've also had those supplemented by an article in Axios, which does look as if it is fairly reliable. Anyway, the long and the short of it is that Donald Trump is now saying that he is indeed going to provide Patriot missile interceptors to Ukraine. It looks as if it is a batch. It is the same batch of 10 that we have been hearing about previously. And there's also reports that offensive missiles are going to be supplied to Ukraine. And the most likely missiles are apparently the JASMs, air-launched missiles, stealth missiles. Now, this is a tantalizing and curious story because the Biden administration made a decision back in August that these missiles would be supplied to Ukraine. We heard August of last year, August of 2024. We heard nothing more about that delivery since then. Zelensky and his officials, however, have recently been talking about a new system that would enable them to conduct deep strikes inside Russia. They've been talking about this for about a week, in fact. And yesterday there was a meeting, I believe it was yesterday, in which Zelensky met with his military officials, and he was talking about the necessity of moving back onto the attack against Russia, transferring the battle back onto Russian territory again. On that topic, I would say that we've been seeing a lot less of drone strikes from Ukraine against targets in Russia over the last 2 weeks or so. And Zelensky's top general, General Syrskyi, spoke about the Ukrainians taking action to restore their positions in Belgorod and Kursk region, and there's been a lot of talk about this. I wonder whether what has happened is that the JASM's delivery that from August, which was pending for some time, there was apparently difficulties integrating the JASMs into the Ukrainian systems, whether the JASM's delivery is now finally coming on stream, and the Ukrainians have been informed about it for some time, and whether Donald Trump, who up to now has resisted all suggestions of weapons deliveries, missile deliveries to Ukraine, capable of hitting targets inside Russia, has finally, over the course of the last week or so, been persuaded to allow the delivery to proceed, maybe Trump informed the Ukrainians about this over the course of his various conversations with Zelensky, particularly the one that he had on the 4th of July, and whether this is what has emboldened Zelensky to talk about missile strikes deep into Russia. Now, of course, the Biden administration back in November green-lighted ATACMS missile strikes into Russia. A few of those took place. They proved largely ineffective. Looking back, it looks as if the JASMs that the Biden administration resolved to supply to Ukraine were intended to replace or substitute for the ineffectual ATACMS missiles that the Russians overall had no difficulty dealing with. And I wonder whether Trump, who previously had spoken of his vehement opposition to missile strikes inside Russia, has now been persuaded to change his stance and to authorize use of the JASMs missiles, which have a range supposedly to strike at targets inside Russia. Now, there's been some commentary about how the JASMs has a range of 500 kilometers and would be capable of hitting targets in Moscow. That would be true if the Ukrainian Air Force were to operate right on close to the borders with Russia, close to the front lines. That would be a very dangerous thing for them to do. Perhaps a more likely target for the JASMs when they are supplied is Crimea, or perhaps other targets closer in Krasnodar rather than Moscow itself. But we'll just have to wait and see. I'm going to make a prediction that if the JASMs are supplied, the Russian air defense system will rapidly adapt to them. That has been the consistent practice of this war. The HIMARS, the ATACMS, the Storm Shadows, all of them proved ultimately unable to break through in sufficient and critical numbers through the Russian air defense system. And of course, the other fundamental problem that Ukraine suffers from is that it lacks a sufficient air force to maintain an effective air campaign against Russia. Ukraine has a small number of F-16s. I've heard reports that it's around 20. There are still some Soviet legacy fighter jets, Sukhoi 27s and MiG-29s, still operating apparently within the Ukrainian Air Force. The air bases, the airfields that Ukraine has are being repeatedly hammered by the Russians. In fact, I would suggest that the recent Russian strikes against the airfields in Zhytomyr and Lutsk suddenly make a lot more sense. Their major purpose, or so it seems to me, is to destroy aircraft, F-16s, F-16s and Soviet legacy aircraft that Ukraine still possesses that might be capable of launching these missiles against Russia. And anyway, one way or the other, we can already see that the Russians look like they're taking countermeasures. As I said, they're attacking the airfields, and they have consistently succeeded through their air defense system in adapting themselves to counter these types of weapons. Now, the JASMs is a modern system. It's stealthy. It's supposed to be advanced. It is exactly the sort of system that the United States was presumably intending to operate against China in the Indo-Pacific region. Now the Russians, and by extension the Chinese, are very quickly going to discover all the facts about this system's design, parameters, and capabilities. Whatever Donald Trump thinks he's doing, if he is indeed intending to supply this weapon system to Ukraine, what he's actually doing is he's enabling the Chinese to develop countermeasures to this system, this air-launched cruise missile, before it is even used against them. The Chinese will now be fully informed and fully advised about its capabilities. Just saying. Anyway, this is a bit speculative because we haven't yet heard reports as to exactly what system Trump intends to supply to Ukraine. I think it's unlikely that it will be more ATACMS missiles because they have clearly failed. There is, of course, in theory, the option of much longer range Tomahawk missiles, but I suspect that the United States would be even less reluctant to part with these strategic missiles. And besides, the Tomahawk is a cruise missile which has its origins back in the 1970s. The Russians are very familiar with it, and I think it would be much more vulnerable to Russian air defense systems than the JASMs is. All of the indications are, the logic suggests that it will be the JASMs. And for the record, quite apart from Trump's own reluctance, perhaps, previously to supply the JASMs missile to Ukraine, I suspect that another factor which has delayed the supply of this missile system is the need to adapt Ukraine's legacy era Soviet fighter jets and the old F-16s that Ukraine has been supplied, which date from the 1980s, to carry this much more modern missile system. Anyway, that's what I'm guessing. Now, there's one further point I should quickly make, which is that the German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius has now categorically ruled out once and for all and forever any supply of Taurus missiles to Ukraine. I assume that the Germans have made that decision because they feel they no longer need to supply Taurus missiles because the JASMs is coming instead. Now, the other important weapon system that the United States is now going to be supplying to Ukraine, as I said, will be the Patriot missile systems. I know nothing about the size of US inventories of the JASMs. Supposedly, the United States has around 7,000 of these, but if we're talking about the long-range, more advanced model, I suspect that the true number of those is much less. And, well, 7,000 sounds a lot, but the United States, as we've seen, has many competing demands on its resources, and Ukraine has only a limited number of aircraft that can launch this system. So I suspect that we're talking about a batch of several hundred, probably not more than that. And as I said, the Russians will quickly adapt themselves to it. I don't believe that the United States is prepared to supply Tomahawk cruise missiles, though you never know. And as for the Patriots, well, we've heard all of the reports about the critical situation with the inventories. And again, as I've discussed, in program after program, there is simply nothing that the United States can do to circumvent that problem. There is no simple response to this. And the fundamental problem, the fundamental crisis, that the United States faces, as I've discussed, is a problem of production. Military industrial production in the United States cannot keep up with the demands made upon it. There is a very good article about this in Unheard, the British Left of Centre magazine. It is by Michael Brendan Dougherty, who is an editor at the National Interest. And he puts it like this: the fact is, America's foreign policy no longer adds up. The commitments made by previous administrations exceed the American ability to meet them. American promises have been outrunning American supply lines. And worse, policymakers have been trying for decades to come up with a model for achieving their foreign policy aims extra democratically. The use of air power, covert ops, drone warfare, and promiscuous outsourcing to local proxies is their admission that the American people cannot be brought to support these foreign policy goals vigorously, taking on real risks and costs. Taken together, it's a recipe for launching idealistic policy and then leaving it marooned. And the article is Ukraine is testing America's limits. There are not enough weapons to go round. That is definitely true of the Patriots. I suspect it will prove before long true of the JASMs as well. And as I said, by supplying JASMs to Ukraine, the United States is giving away critical information that the Chinese will be able to use if and when a confrontation between China and the United States does indeed take place in the Indo-Pacific region. So, there is another consequence to this, which is that, of course, by making this decision, by supplying offensive weapons to Ukraine, the President, Donald Trump, is now departing completely from the repeated promises he made to his electoral base, which was led to believe that Donald Trump would aim to end America's involvement in these types of forever wars. Already, one can sense that the president is becoming increasingly rattled by the deep and growing alienation of sections of his electoral base. He's just written an extraordinary piece, an extraordinary comment, I might even call it a rant, on Truth Social, in which he explodes with anger about the criticism he's getting from parts of his base about his Justice Department's decision to stop all further disclosures about the case of the financier involved in trafficking and other abusive allegations that I have touched on in previous programs. The president, and by the way, his Attorney General, who he defends in this commentary, had previously given the clear impression that they were going to reveal all about this case, where, to say it straightforwardly, far too little has been disclosed. Information has been kept away from the American people. He has reversed, or rather his administration has reversed course on this. There's been inevitably the criticisms. There's been inevitably the speculations as to why this has happened. The president has reacted with growing anger and irritation in the face of this criticism. He's now criticizing his own base because they took his previous assurances seriously, and one can sense from his comment that he's now rattled about it. He's already been irritated and annoyed about the previous criticism he received about the supply of, the involvement of the United States in the 12-day war against Iran. He mentions that also, incidentally, in this particular comment that has appeared on Truth Social. He has also tried to cover himself again by giving assurances that all weapons that the United States supplies from now on will be paid for by Ukraine, presumably relying upon money from Europe. Well, I have to say, I don't take that terribly seriously, and nobody should. Senator Rand Paul has basically put this best. He said that continuing to provide assistance to Ukraine is like taking out a loan to help a homeless person. Ukraine is bankrupt. Anybody can see this. The situation in its economy and its finances is now rapidly deteriorating. It makes absolutely no sense for the United States, or the Europeans for that matter, to go on providing Ukraine with funding. There continues to be talk, of course, of dipping into, or indeed outright confiscating, the frozen Russian assets. I've already spoken about the enormous dubious legality of that step. But anyway, here we are. Here we see the president trying to reassure his base that, in fact, it's not going to cost anything to the United States because all of these weapons are going to be paid for by the Europeans. Then, of course, that brings us back to another truth that we have seen throughout this conflict, and which exposed the accounting practices, was exposed as a result of the accounting practices followed by the previous administration, the Biden administration. Because whenever they sent weapons to Ukraine, and this apparently became eventually the standard practice, the United States valued the weapons that it sent to Ukraine at their original purchase cost, not at the cost of replacement. Now, is that going to happen with the weapons that the United States now intends to supply to Ukraine? The JASMs and the Patriots and all of those weapons? Because if so, then of course the American people are going to have to pay, because the cost of weapons price inflation is just about the highest inflation that there is for any type of manufactured product, and the cost of replacing weapons that are sent to Ukraine is going to be much higher than the book cost of the weapons that were supplied themselves. Anyway, we will have to wait and see. By the time you're probably watching this program, there will be more clarity, no doubt, from the president. He will be providing us with more information about what he is doing. For the record, I do not think that his base, or at least prominent members of his base, are going to be impressed by these subterfuges that the president is currently engaged in. I think that they can tell that the president is now veering further and further away from his promises. They will also, or some of them, those who follow events more closely, will have noticed that General Kellogg, the original promoter of Donald Trump's ceasefire plan, the man who wrote that article back in April 2024, the man who has consistently taken a more pro-Ukrainian line amongst Donald Trump's advisors. Anyway, Kellogg has now been sent to Kiev. He's apparently going to be in Kiev for a whole week, discussing weapons deliveries, sanctions policy, all of those things. It looks like he's coordinating deeply with the Ukrainians. We haven't heard much about Kellogg for several weeks now, but he's now been brought back into prominence. And Witkoff, the person who previously seemed to be taking the lead role in negotiating with the Russians and with the Iranians, well, he is nowhere to be seen. One of the most accurate ways of measuring, in my opinion, the current line that the president is taking is by looking to see which of these two advisors is being given greater prominence. When it's Witkoff, you know that a policy of accommodation and negotiation is being followed. When it's Kellogg, on the contrary, it is unstinting support for Ukraine. Now, that then brings us back to why the president has undertaken this extraordinary reversal, why he's now taking on his base, what exactly is going on. Well, I'm going to give my own explanation about this. There's been a whole deluge of articles over the last couple of days which say that Trump has become absolutely exasperated with Putin's inflexibility. He'd expected Putin to be more flexible than he actually was. I find that very strange and very bizarre, because Putin outlined his negotiating position back in June 2024. The Russians have repeatedly explained to the Americans that this is a complex conflict. Negotiations will take a long time, and expecting that a conflict of this nature can be resolved in a few days or a few weeks in the way that the president has at times suggested is absurd. And the idea that the Russians should stop launching missile strikes at Kiev or facilities around Kiev, that they should stop attacking air bases and that sort of thing whilst the conflict goes on, is preposterous. The Ukrainians have never shown any such moderation in their drone attacks against Russia. So why should the Russians? And of course, the Russians can also point to the fact that the US's Israeli allies conduct strikes on all sorts of countries. They conduct strikes in Gaza, which kill far more civilians than the Russians have killed in Ukraine, multiple times, orders of magnitude more civilians than the Russians have inflicted on Ukraine. The Israelis launched what was clearly a decapitation strike aimed to achieve regime change against Iran at a time when negotiations between the United States and Iran were actually underway. And of course, Donald Trump has never at any point pushed back or criticised any of these things. He's never spoken about Prime Minister Netanyahu being crazy or said any things of that kind. On the contrary, in the case of Iran, he himself took the decision that the United States should also attack Iran over the course of the 12-day war. So for the president to really say that Putin is behaving in an extraordinarily inflexible way, to me at least, that makes absolutely no sense. It just shows that Trump wasn't listening to what Putin was saying, and clearly has become increasingly frustrated about this. And since this has been obvious, I mean, Putin has never made any secret of his position since Trump was inaugurated back in January. I cannot believe that it was the single thing that pushed Trump to make the decision that he just has. So what is the explanation for his decision? Well, I'm going to suggest that it is something much more proximate and much more obvious. And I'm afraid, again, what I'm going to say is going to be misunderstood by some people. But to stress again, I think what I'm going to say is even more damning than any of the other explanations of this, which are rooted in assumptions of some clever policy or clever political line. And I'm going to say it straightforwardly. I think what has created this event is the disclosure, the decision about 2 weeks ago by the Pentagon to pause deliveries of essential weapons to Ukraine. Patriot missile interceptors, Stinger missiles, HIMARS rocket systems, weapons which are increasingly in short supply. There's been leaks to The Guardian, which shows that the Patriot missile inventory, the United States' inventory of Patriot missiles, is down to 25% of where the Pentagon wants it to be. I've discussed in many programs that the United States is simply not in a position to conjure up weapons that it simply doesn't have. The United States has been trying to get more weapons from its allies, more Patriot missiles from its allies to make up the numbers. Germany has just made further statements. Boris Pistorius has said that Germany is now desperately short of Patriot missiles itself, that it's already supplied several Patriot missile batteries to Ukraine. It cannot continue to supply Patriot missile batteries. Pistorius, who in terms of policy with Russia has been a consistent hardliner within the German political system, he is basically saying that Germany has no more of these systems to give, nor do any of the United States' other European allies, nor, so far as I can see, are any of the United States' other allies either. Given that the United States is in conflict with Iran, with the possibility that Israel could resume its attacks on Iran at any time, and that the Iranians might counter by launching missile strikes against Israel and against American bases in the Middle East, which would again require further use of Patriot missiles, drawing down the inventories even further. Given that the United States has to stockpile air defense missiles to counter China, given the American admission of the very limited level of its stockpiles and of the limited level of its own production of air defense missile interceptors, which American ally is going to part with air defense missile interceptors supplied by the United States, which it still has, given that it must know that there is no prospect anytime soon of it ever receiving a replacement? So, Trump, confronted with all of this, having the reality that his peace through strength mantra has been exposed, because the United States, as it turns out, is not quite as strong after all, telephoned Putin, tried to get Putin to agree to a ceasefire. Putin again refused, and the result is the tantrum we've seen play out over the last week. To me, I have to say, all of these actions look like more like a tantrum than anything else. The rude comments about Putin, the decision to supply the JASM's missiles to make up for the weakness in Patriot missile supplies. It all looks to me like an attempt, again, to try to make the Russians and the Chinese feel that the United States and, of course, Donald Trump himself are strong after all. My colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou, has repeatedly spoken about the folly, the trap that this whole peace through strength mantra that the Trump administration foisted on itself has turned out to be. And I think that we have seen repeated indications of this. We saw this in the botched attack on Houthis, the attack on Iran, which has created a profound and seemingly unresolvable crisis, with the United States unaware of the whereabouts of Iran's uranium enrichment facilities, uranium enrichment stockpile, and of its ability to move forward with its enrichment program. And with Iran, of course, refusing negotiations despite desperate urging from the United States to get Iran to agree to do that. And we now see this again with the decision by the United States to part, as I believe, with one of its more modern systems, compromising its capabilities in relation to its adversaries, to achieve little to no effect on the battlefronts, once again, out of a desperate desire to project strength when it is becoming increasingly obvious to Xi Jinping, to Vladimir Putin, to American adversaries around the world, that that strength simply isn't there. Now, coming back to that article by Michael Brendan Doherty, he actually talks about the folly of this constant attempt to bluff American enemies by making it appear that the United States is stronger than it really is. And he says this: hawks in both parties have argued that the only way to prevent China from making an attempt at Taiwan and from breaking US supremacy in the Pacific is to back Ukraine and Israel to the hilt. Their theory is that we can deter Xi Jinping by demonstrating sheer will. It is a theory of deterrence that obviously appeals to moralizing columnists whose stances risk them nothing. But surely Xi Jinping is doing just what the Pentagon is doing now, seriously considering what the depletion of US weapons stockpiles means for him. His foreign minister, Wang Yi, made remarks just this week to European diplomats implying that China sees strategic benefit in a prolonged conflict in Ukraine. That is the South China Morning Post article that I discussed several programs ago, because it keeps the United States, its allies, and their resources tied up in Europe. Our grandiose promises, these supposed demonstrations of will, do not intimidate China, not when they're followed up with delayed deliveries and decayed credibility. That is obviously correct. Xi Jinping can do the numbers, so can Vladimir Putin, so, by the way, can Iran. They can see that the United States, certainly in its air defense capabilities, is increasingly running on empty. They know about the realities of Western and specifically US artillery and artillery shell production. They can read articles like the one that appeared a week ago in The Economist that I discussed in another program about how the United States no longer has an industrial base and must somehow rearm without one. They are aware of all of these things. The idea that appearing to show strength, an exercise of the will, is going to deter all of these countries, is to bluff these countries to an even more monstrous level than has been the case up to now. But I'm afraid it is the sort of stance that appeals to this particular president, who finds it very, very difficult ever to admit that there are limits to what he can do and to what the United States can do. Even though he continuously denies commonality with the neocons, who, incidentally, he fiercely criticised just a few weeks ago over the course of a trip to Saudi Arabia. The reality is that in this, the insistence upon the will, upon willpower over substance, the refusal to recognize limits, he is identical with them. Anyway, there we are. Now, all of this is continuing, and in the meantime, the Russians remain entirely unfazed. They continue with their offensive in Ukraine. And there's been a cascade of reports over the last 24 hours, and they are very interesting. Now, perhaps the most interesting revelation, in fact, over the last 24 hours is that Russia's chief military officer, its most senior military officer, the man who is the overall military commander of the Russian forces engaged in the special military operation, the man who's also the chief of the general staff of the Russian armed forces, General Valery Gerasimov, has just visited the Pokrovsk area and has been having discussions there with senior Russian military commanders. And this comes a few days after Gerasimov visited the Russian forces in the southwest Donetsk area, the same forces that are now pushing towards the Dnieper. And of course, it comes directly after the Russian defense minister, Andrei Belousov, visited the Russian forces that are advancing towards the Dnieper as well. Now, all of this strongly suggests to me that these are the two key areas of priority, the Pokrovsk area and the advance to the Dnieper from southwest Donbass, the advance westwards towards the city of Zaporozhye and the Dnieper from the east. Now, all of this is coming alongside rumours and reports and claims that the Russians are preparing some huge offensive in the second half of the summer. Axios is even claiming that what pushed Trump to decide to move forward and to authorize the weapons deliveries that he's going to talk about today, that what pushed Trump over the edge was that supposedly over the course of their telephone conversation on the 3rd of July, Putin told Trump that at some point in the next maybe 60 days or something like that, the Russians were going to launch a great offensive in Ukraine and that this would decide the war. And supposedly Trump was furious about this, and when he spoke to Macron, he said that Putin is aiming to take the lot. I'm going to say straight away that I do not for one moment believe this story. I think it is inconceivable that Vladimir Putin, who is one of the most careful leaders around, an individual who is extremely careful not to say more at any point than he must, would discuss Russian military plans in a conversation with the President of the United States. I think that story is being further put around in order to provide some cover for Trump so that he can explain to his base the extraordinary policy reversal he is undertaking now. And in fact, all of this is consistent with reports and rumours about a Russian offensive in the second half of the summer, which has been circulating for a while. The German newspaper Bild Zeitung, German tabloid newspaper, is now also talking about a major Russian offensive taking place midsummer. Supposedly 30,000 North Korean troops will join it. Where Bild Zeitung gets that information from, I would love to know. But anyway, that there is going to be this huge Russian offensive in midsummer. My own view is that all of this is completely wrong, and again is based on a misunderstanding of what has been happening on the actual battlefronts. In my opinion, the Russian offensive, the Russian summer offensive, began in April. It's already been underway for several weeks. It began, in fact, directly after Russia's successful collapse of the Kursk salient that the Ukrainians had carved out around Sudzha, the town of Sudzha, in March. The Russians then began their their offensive right across the contact line in April. They have been gradually, methodically, as they do, piling up the pressure week after week, as they always do. They've been grinding the Ukrainians, gaining more strategic ground, capturing more villages, more pieces on the chessboard, if you like. Nowadays, the Russians invariably announce the capture of several villages on any particular day, whereas previously it used to be one a day, and then previously it was one a week, as I remember. But anyway, the Russians have been gradually scooping up more and more places, and they have been positioning themselves and shaping the battlefield, to use an expression that I know military people like to use, in ways that they can exploit for further and future advances. So, to give an example, there's been much discussion about the buffer zones that the Russians have been creating in Sumy and Kharkiv region, the fact that the Russians have made further advances in the Volchansk area, for example, the fact that they've crossed the border in various places, the fact that they have advanced into Sumy region. There are more Russian claims this morning, by the way, that the village of Yunakovka in Sumy region has indeed fallen under Russian control. There's been no confirmation of that, however, from the Russian Defense Ministry, just saying. My own view, as I said, is that these positions that the Russians are capturing in northern Ukraine are intended less as a buffer zone and more as springboards for future Russian advances. Once the critical breakthrough takes place further south, and that breakthrough is going to be in Donbass and in the Zaporozhye region. And, well, I'm not going to discuss in detail because, as I said, I'm under certain constraints today, the facts around the events in Donbass. But with every day now, we get more reports of further Russian advances as the Russians steadily push westwards towards the Dnieper. More villages fall every single day. There are reports that the Ukrainians are unable to stabilize the situation in this region. A breakthrough is clearly already taking place, but the bigger breakthrough and the biggest operational crisis that the Ukrainians seem to be facing continues to be around Pakrovsk. Well, here again, there's been many more reports of the Russians having captured more territory, substantial more territory, north and northeast of Pakrovsk. There's been a long discussion of how the Russians now have established complete drone control over the roads, the supply roads leading into Pakrovsk from the north. Now, back in the summer of 2024, the pattern of Russian advances is that first there was the FABs and the missiles, then the drones followed, cutting the supply roads, then the reconnaissance groups, and then the infantry. So where the drones go tends to be a good sign of where the Russians intend eventually to move to. And with the Russians operating along the roads, the supply roads, north and northwest of Pakrovsk, apparently dozens of vehicles, Ukrainian vehicles, trying to send supplies to Pakrovsk are being attacked and destroyed along the roads by the Russian drones. Well, that, I think, is a clear indication of what the Russian plans in this area are. The gradual, not just encirclement, but engulfing of Pakrovsk. The Russians, since the Bakhmut operation of 2023, no longer seek, it seems to me, to storm towns, fortified towns, head on. What they always aim to do is to cut the supply lines, to create a crisis, a supply crisis, for the Ukrainians who are defending themselves in these towns, and then eventually the towns drop into the Russians' lap because the Ukrainians can no longer maintain their forces there. And this is now intensifying around Pakrovsk. And to be frank, I don't think that this can continue for very much longer. Something in the Pakrovsk area is going to break. It seems that events around Konstantinovka, a much bigger place than Pakrovsk, or at least a bigger place than Pakrovsk, but also one that is connected to the Slavyansk, Kramatorsk conurbation, that this area is more complex, it's more heavily built up. Cutting the supply roads here is a more complex operation. I suspect that the Russians ultimately aim to finish Konstantinovka. Once they have finished Pakrovsk, the loss of Pakrovsk will allow the Russians to outflank Konstantinovka as well. As I said, it's very much maybe more like drafts than chess. You gradually, as I said, shape your position until pieces basically fall because they cannot be defended anymore. But the key thing, again, is that I don't think that there is anything that the Ukrainians or the Western powers can do to prevent this. And coming back to the situation, the current situation, it's perhaps worth adding that a lot of the speculation about this big Russian offensive in the second half of this year almost certainly does not derive on things that Vladimir Putin supposedly gave away over the course of a heated conversation with Donald Trump on the 3rd of July. It is presumably because the Ukrainians and the Western powers are aware of the existence of these two big Russian reserve armies in the rear, the fact that the Russians have 250,000 men ready, and this must be making them nervous. And if they're getting information about the serial production by the Russians of the Okhotnik missiles, then of course that is going to make the Western powers more nervous still. Speaking of the Okhotnik, that again perhaps exposes the enormous imbalance in some respects in power which exists now, not just between Ukraine and Russia, but in terms of military technologies and capabilities between the Western powers and the Eurasian powers. The United States probably is on the brink of supplying the JASMs missiles to Ukraine, subsonic missiles that can hit targets inside Russia and which are stealthy and advanced, but hardly the last word in technology. It seems that the Russian Kh-69 missile, which has been launched against Ukrainian targets increasingly by the Russians, by the way, over the course of the last few months, approximately matches the JASM's overall capabilities. The United States, however, has no hypersonic missiles. It has no equivalent to the Kinzhal or Zircon missiles, and it absolutely has nothing that can match either the capability or either the hypersonic speeds or the impact capability of the Okhotnik missile, which the Russians are now producing in quantity. On the question of the Okhotnik missile, there's a point, by the way, which I have noticed that nobody has been making about it. Back in the autumn, the Russians launched a strike with a single Okhotnik missile against the gigantic Yuzhny factory in Dnipro, an enormous factory, a key part of Ukraine's military-industrial complex, a factory built by the Soviet Union for the production of intercontinental ballistic missiles, but also for various other types of large rockets, and which is continuing to operate and function once it came into the possession of Ukraine, and which apparently was supplying the Ukrainian military during the course of the special military operation with munitions. Now, there was a great deal of discussion and speculation about the actual effect of the Okhotnik strike on this factory in Dnipro. Some saying that it was merely a token strike with missile warheads that had no actual explosive charges and that no real damage was done. Others who were claiming that immense amounts of damage were done were talking about the real capabilities of these warheads, which used a special aluminium-based type of explosive. There was never any certainty about this, but the one thing we can say is that the Russians have not attacked this factory again, and the Ukrainians have revealed nothing further about its actual state. We've heard nothing more, in fact, about this factory. At least I have heard nothing more about this factory since the Ochotnik strike took place. Contrast that with the enormous discussions and rumours and debates about the condition of Fordow, the enrichment facility buried inside a mountain which the United States attacked inside Iran. Could it be that the reason we don't hear anything more about this factory is that the Ochotnik strike was every bit as devastating as Putin suggested, and that this factory is indeed out of operation? Just saying. I don't know. There might be other explanations, but the fact is that the Ochotnik presumably will be in service with the Russian military in quantity before long, and it's a lot more powerful a system, whatever it does, than the JASMs. Well, there it is. By the time you watch this program, it's likely that Donald Trump will have spoken, will have a better sense and idea of what he's doing. But as I said, this is going to be a shorter video today. They're not much shorter, and this is where I have to stop. There might, of course, also be some announcements about sanctions today, but maybe I'm wrong here, but I get the sense that Trump is still arguing with Blumenthal and Graham about the exact phrasing of the sanctions bill that is currently navigating its way through Congress. To repeat again, whatever it is that Trump does, it is not going to change the dynamics. It looks to me like a tantrum. When it is over, it's entirely possible that Trump will flip again. Given how volatile and unpredictable his decision-making has become, that would seem entirely plausible to me. But Medvedev, the deputy chair of the Russian Security Council, I think put the Russian position well. He said that Trump changes his stance and his comments from one day to the next. His decisions are completely unpredictable. They never head in any definite direction. The best thing for the Russians to do is to pay no attention to him, just to go ahead, carry on with their plans, fulfill their plans, fight the war, win the war, and basically ignore Donald Trump. The head of Russia's investment fund, Kirill Dmitriev, still apparently wants to maintain some kind of dialogue with the Americans. I would not be surprised if before long, like the Iranians, the Russians finally make the decision that a dialogue with the Americans, certainly on the topic of Ukraine, is a complete waste of time. That the Americans remain agreement incapable, and that the only thing for the Russians to do is to concentrate on the war and to win it. Well, that's my program for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patriot and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Oh, I forgot to say that for certain items, we will provide free delivery anywhere in the world. Just to say, you get to our shop. So there's an opportunity which you surely cannot miss. But anyway, just to finish, you can also support our work by making sure, if you've liked this video, that you've ticked the like button and by checking your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.